let's just wrap up King v. Burwell a little bit, because this case is really interesting to me, not just because of the implications on Obamacare, but because of A, what it says about the Supreme Court, and B, what it could do in the states in terms of Republicans are supposedly trying to come up with some type of legislative fix for Congress. If this happens, it's not going to be fixed in Congress. It's going to be fixed in the states, or in the states between the federal government and the states. And I have one theory. I want to bounce this off you as to why they why they chose this case. And you tell me if this is not just a little bit too conspiratorial. I don't think conspiratorial is the right way. Whether or not this is just a little bit overthought.
Okay.
That I talked to a lot of people as to why they took this case now, and some people said, well, it was sort of unique insofar as there was no real legitimate circuit split, but it's quite possible they anticipated there would be, and they figured they'll deal with it now. Or the conservative justices were so hungry to get at this and knew that they couldn't destroy the Affordable Care Act if they waited much longer. My guess is that there were 3 conservative justices, and maybe someone like Kagan. Kagan may have said, like, let's get this over with. This case is ridiculous. It's going to be floating around. There was already 2 cases, Halbig versus Burwell and King versus Burwell. It's all rolled into King, basically. If we don't pick it up now, they're going to be doing this in circuit courts all across the country. It's going to maintain so let's just get it over with. But I'm not convinced that at least one of those conservative justices, and a guy like Scalia, I think, thinks this way, says, if we're going to do this, we need to do this now, not just because we don't want Obamacare to be further entrenched, but imagine if they ruled for the plaintiffs and it was July or June 2016 instead of 2015.
Yes. I absolutely agree with that.
I think they would lose a couple of Republican-controlled states.
They will. You have to keep in mind here, what we know already from looking at this, okay? From the Supreme Court's behavior for the last decade and a half. And one thing that's entirely clear is that for all his bluster and all his BS, Antonin Scalia is a politician in a robe. Okay, he's not. He is a right-wing politician. Bush v. Gore turned on the question of equality. And Bush wasn't, because if his votes weren't counted, wouldn't be granted that right. This is a concept that Scalia never gave a crap about until the moment that it helped his side. And much like in this one, there's plenty about Kennedy that drives me crazy. But at least he largely is consistent. He defers a lot to the states, like he's done in the past on gay marriage and other things where he's come out on the quote-unquote liberal side, of some of these arguments. And here even he's saying, could this unintentionally lead to the federal government forcing more things upon the states?
Right.
So I may disagree with his philosophy, and I do, but at least it's consistent. At least there's some consistency to what Kennedy says. Whereas Scalia, there's no consistency whatsoever. When it comes to things like voting rights or whatever, he's all worried about states' rights. On something like this, couldn't care less about them. It's much like conservatives in many other areas. If they can force states to stop passing good environmental laws, to stop passing gay marriage laws, to stop passing gun safety laws, to stop passing laws that are pro-women and pro-women's equality, they'll do all that from the federal government, or they'll stop localities from doing it from the state government, because they don't give a damn about this philosophy they supposedly support. Because it doesn't, it's only on all the other cases where it does lend itself to their worldview that they suddenly, that everything should be right wing, that they suddenly care about it. And so that's the thing. If anybody here thinks for a second, and Alito seems to come very much from that ilk too. Mm-hmm. Clarence Thomas, I'm not quite sure about, as much as I just think he's a bit of a crazy person. I'm not sure if it's as much political planning on this stuff. I think there's other stuff going on there. But those 2 guys are basically politicians, is what they are. Roberts, I think, is still a little bit more of a question mark. And again, I'd say Kennedy, somebody at least seems to have some principles. I think they're wrong, but at least seems to. So, I think Scalia is thinking that. I think both those things you brought up are exactly right. The longer this thing stays out there, the more people, are able to rely on these subsidies and get good health care, the more people that are injured, and this largely ends up being, guess who? White working class Southerners disproportionately, or people who vote Republican, who are going to be hurt by this when they do this, And so if they do this, if they take away their subsidies. So there's that. And then what you said, they don't want this anywhere near an election because, Scalia thinks about these kinds of things and realizes that he's no spring chicken and Kennedy's no spring chicken, but neither is Ginsburg. And there's a chance that the next president of the United States puts three Supreme Court justices on there.
Right. And again, I think, when we're talking about people in the exchanges, all the action is in the states. As opposed to it being even a national issue on some level. And so if you are a state that refuses to make a fix that you can see a state next door has made a fix because they've been able to just make a sort of a nominal change in who established the exchange with the federal government, there's going to be an enormous amount of pressure on you, amount of pressure.
That's right. So this is in the history of utterly ridiculous cases, which I think starts with Bush v. Gore, with the sort of conservative tilt of this court, but I may be missing one or two from the late 90s. This may be the most ridiculous. It's hard to say anything that is more ridiculous than Bush v. Gore. Not that they're necessarily taking that case, although it is something that they always said should be figured out by the states. But at least conservatives claim to. But okay, if an issue is as important as a presidential election, taking it, the conclusion they came to was utterly ridiculous in so many ways. But this, based on the typo and the plaintiffs really having no realistic standing in this thing, if you're following, let's say, the law per se, about people actually having to be harmed by something, there really is none. And there's so many reasons that this thing should have been laughed out and never taken by this court. So, my guess is you're right. Some of the liberal justices might have been like, look, it's going to be taken by this court, so we might as well just get it out of the way and bat this thing down. And the conservative ones had different reasons. In the end, it seems to me, from analysis by people smarter than me who were there and were watching this, they're thinking very much that some of the questions Kennedy asked and some of the questions that Roberts asked, that they may be questioning whether this is a good idea and whether they can justify coming to that ruling. Even Alito, who I still think will do it because he's a vicious right-winger and a nut, he was going to have a stay, initially, so that theoretically the problems could be solved.
Yes, he was contemplating the notion of what if you had the ruling, then you gave everybody 6 to 8 months or whatever it was, which actually cuts against him, or I should say cuts towards him finding for the plaintiff, because he's trying to figure out a solution, the best way to find for the plaintiff. And you're right, Kennedy spoke about this notion of constitutional avoidance, it's called, where if you interpret the statute in such a way that is unconstitutional, then and there's another reasonable interpretation, you follow that other interpretation if it's nearly as reasonable, because you don't want to find a law to be unconstitutional, and he thinks it might be because of the coercion. You're right, but I guess we will revisit this sometime in June or July, and we'll find out.
I think the decision's supposed to be in June, and I think there's a good chance they'll do the right thing from the questions. But again, even though to be very clear, I've given Kennedy some credit for having a philosophy. If you look at all of his cases, the ones that are rightly and wrongly decided, all for his wrong philosophy. There's some consistency. Let's remember, there was nothing consistent about where he went with Bush v. Gore.
Right, and also think about Citizens United. This is the guy who sort of claimed that, look, there's not going to be...
There's no appearance of impropriety.
Right, exactly.
There'd be no direct pressure. It's only direct bribery. I give you X for Y. It's not when somebody just starts a super PAC who used to be on your staff, and then somebody else gives them $30 million, there's no expectation that maybe next time they'll give it to somebody else if you don't do what they want.
Right.
Yes, that kind of common sense. No, he's far from perfect and probably would be considered a terrible justice except for the people he's sitting next to on the right. So don't get me wrong in trying to ascribe too many principles to him. I'm just saying at least he has a bit more of a principled take on these things and has than those 3 or so hacks on the far right and Roberts most of the time. So I think you could see a 5-4 or 6-3 decision in the right direction, but don't bet on it.